Hi, everybody. Concept 2.4 here, price indices and inflation. So this one gets confusing for people. So I'm going to try to break it down for you as basically as I can. And then we'll just have to practice actually doing these calculations. That's key to understanding what CPI is, how to calculate it, and then what inflation is and how to calculate that. So two slightly different things, but they go together. Much like you have to identify labor force before you can calculate unemployment, you have to identify CPI or consumer price index before you can calculate inflation. So let's break it down. The reason we use inflation as one of our lead indicators, GDP, unemployment, inflation, that's the trifecta that we are trying to employ. We use inflation because stability of prices is really, really important. Later on, I'm going to talk about what happens when hyperinflation occurs. It can be really devastating to an economy to the point where you kind of just have to hit reset, which is about as catastrophic as one could possibly imagine. All right, so let's get into it. 2.4 inflation. As defined, inflation is the rise of general prices. We call it price level, but when price level is going up, when the price of all goods and all services are going up, if wages aren't keeping pace with that, then it's actually got some pretty significant consequences. It means even if GDP is growing, we are all getting poorer. So it's really important to understand prices and what they are. So here is an example of the rising prices as far as its impact on our income. So the same $20 in 1998 could get you a full shopping cart. In 2005, a little less. In 2013, maybe four or five goods. Prices have risen, but we haven't experienced the full impact of that because we're not just taking $20 to the grocery store anymore, right? Incomes have risen as well. We'll talk later about how that hasn't quite kept pace in the United States of America, but generally speaking, price level is only an issue or inflation is only an issue when it is outpacing our wages. Okay, so let's get into it. So, like I said before, in order to understand and calculate inflation, you have to understand and be able to calculate consumer price index. So, with any index, it's just trying to say, based on last year's prices and this year's prices, here's about where we're at. Here's what's happening. Here's a comparable number, right? So we use indexes all the time. The idea is when your index is at 100, you're in your base year or base element. We'll talk about that more in a second. So indexes are just a way to convert all these convoluted prices that are all over the places and put it into a number that we can actually work with, right? You can't measure the change in price in every good and every service across the entire United States. It is practically impossible to do, right? You'd be working all year long and your numbers wouldn't even be very useful or helpful. So what happens is the economists have decided on a market basket. Every year they come up with a market basket or every 2 years. That market basket includes 300 goods, right? So these are goods and services that they hand select that represent the spending patterns of our urban population. So in cities, this is generally the types of stuff that people buy. They do urban because normally urban prices increase quicker than suburban or rural prices. Okay, so oftentimes you go to a rural area, you're going to pay less than if you're in New York City, for example. So 300 goods and services. Then they measure those prices. How have those changed over time? So in the United States, we decided to make our base year 1982 to 1984, a 2-year base year market basket. And then we take our current market basket value, it's going to be in dollars. We divide current market basket by base year market basket, multiply it by 100, and we get a number. Okay, so it's actually not all that difficult to do. Just have to understand you have to calculate CPI using market basket, not the inflation number or inflation equation we'll talk about here in a second. It's just current market basket divided by base year market basket times 100. So I'll give you an example. Normally they will tell you what year is a market basket. So it's not always going to be 1982 to 84, but they might say, hey, here are 3 years. Year 2 is the market basket, base year market basket or something like that. Okay, so let's say our current market basket is $150. $150. So we took our 300 goods, we added up their prices, it makes $150. Our base year price market basket, let's say, is $100. So I'm going to divide 150 by 100, and that's going to kick out 1.5. Just current divided by base year. And again, they will tell you what that base year is. They have to. So 1.5. I multiply that by 100. My CPI is 150. My CPI is 150. What this is really saying is since the base year, our prices have gone up 50%. How do I know since the base year? Well, my base year, if my current market basket is the same as my base year, so if I'm in 1982 to 84 and I'm dividing this out, it would be $100 divided by $100, which means my CPI, that would kick out the number 1, which means my CPI would be 100. In other words, the consumer price index, which just kind of communicates to us what's happening with prices, in the base year will always, always, always be 100. You have to write that down. In the base year, CPI will always, always, always be 100. So when CPI is 150 currently, that means since the base year, we've had a 50% growth in prices. If CPI was 220, since the base year, we've had a 120% growth in prices. If CPI is 105, since the base year, we've had a 5% growth in overall prices. That's what CPI communicates to us. Okay? All right, let's keep on going. So first you find CPI. Oh, here's what's included in the market basket in case you were wondering. About 42.5222% of it is housing. Then we have food and beverage, we've got transportation in there, medical care, recreation. So they find 300 goods that is in this range, kind of this percentage, and they measure the prices. And how did these things change this year versus our market basket where they were 82 to 84? And then we use that to give us an index that helps us identify what's going on with prices. Okay? So it's this multi-step process to really try to understand a very complex and diverse thing like price changes by minimizing and saying, this is really kind of the core elements of what makes our life work. Here's what people spend their money on. And so here's what's going on with those prices. Okay, so that's CPI. Now, that's different than inflation. CPI is different than inflation. All you do is you take your CPIs. You have to have those first. You take those CPIs and you plug it into our percentage growth equation. You already know this. This is how we find percent change in GDP or growth in GDP. We're looking at growth and prices. We just call it inflation, but it's growth and prices. So it's going to be current CPI minus previous CPI divided by previous CPI times 100. That kicks out your inflation rate. So if you know the growth rate for GDP, you know the inflation rate equation too. Okay, so let's say our current CPI is 120. So let's call this year 1 or year 2. That's current, year 2. In year 1, my CPI was 100. First of all, my CPI is 100 in year 1. What's true about year 1? That's got to be my base year. Year 1 is my base year. Base year is always 100. That's where we start. Okay? So I simply plug these numbers in. I'm going to do 120 minus previous year, which is 100, divided by previous year, which is 100. So 20 divided by 100, which is going to kick out 0.2. I multiply that by 100, or I move that decimal over 2 places. My inflation rate is going to be 20%. That's simple. Oftentimes you're asked inflation rate and you're given CPI and you just plug the numbers in. Sometimes you're asked inflation rate, you're given market baskets. So I have to first take current market basket divided by base year market basket. That kicks out a CPI. Then I use that CPI and I plug it into current minus previous divided by previous to get inflation. Okay, let's keep going. Now, there are other things included in this. There's also deflation. Inflation is an increase in CPI, which is normally what happens, right? Deflation is when our index indicates that the inflation rate is going down. It's negative, not just decreasing from last year to this year, but it's negative from last year to this year. That's deflation. This actually can be devastating to an economy because it hits businesses first. The businesses, they gain when inflation happens, right? They raise their prices right away and they make profit because they don't have to raise the wages right away. I raise the prices, my people get paid the same. I wait for them to negotiate a higher wage. That difference between what pay my employees and what I charge, that's extra profit. But deflation works the opposite way. I have to keep paying my workers, but my prices have fallen. Now I'm experiencing losses. And when a nation experiences losses, what do? They lay people off. Unemployment rate starts to rise. Okay? So deflation can have a negative effect because it affects businesses first. Inflation affects consumers first, and they're more willing to pay a higher price without an increase in wage because it's something we often experience. Okay, so that's deflation, negative inflation rates. There are two types of inflation. There's demand pull and there's cost push. Now, you don't know much about aggregate demand yet, and we'll explain it a little bit. But basically, aggregate demand is the demand of all goods and all services. So when people are spending too much money, it's called demand pull inflation. I know it doesn't sound like it would be a thing. But think of it this way: if there's a buying frenzy, everybody is going and buying goods and services at the same time. Well, aggregate demand shifts right, or demand shifts right, which we know increases price. In our economy, it increases price level. But this can cause hyperinflation because I see, oh man, prices are going up. Consumer expectations. If I know prices are going up in the future, what do I do today? I buy more stuff. So people scramble out to buy more things today because I'm worried the price is going to continue to rise in the future. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. By all of us going out and buying things today, demand does shift right. It creates higher prices in the future. People are like, oh no, the prices are going up again. I better go out and buy more things today because of consumer expectations. When I do that, demand shifts right, price rises. I get worried. I buy things today, demand shifts right, price rises, and this creates hyperinflation. This has happened several times in the history of our world in many different nations, luckily not here in the United States, but we have examples where people are running, getting paid multiple times a day, running to the grocery store to try and outpace the person changing the prices on the products, try to get in front of them so they can buy them at the lower price because the prices are rising at an astronomical rate. That's demand pull inflation. It has the potential to completely devastate an economy. And it's all caused because we just spend too much. We outpace the production. The second is cost push. We know cost impacts supply. So this is caused from supply shifting left. Now you understand this because you know demand and supply. When supply shifts left, prices rise. When we're looking at our economy as a whole, when aggregate supply shifts right, price left, price level rises. So this is caused by an increase in input costs. OPEC is a great example of this. OPEC is this oil conglomerate, is an oligopoly, and they collude, they work together to make artificially high prices. As a result, in the 1980s and 90s, it shifted our aggregate supply left because the prices kept rising for oil. When prices rise, price level goes up on all goods and all services, right? So that's cost push inflation. It's bad because it creates two things. Not only is price level going up, but we're producing less, right? Supply shifting left. When production falls, what's that? That means GDP is falling, which means that people are losing their jobs. So cost push is bad temporarily because it causes price level to rise and it causes unemployment to rise. Both of those things. So not only do we have inflation, but we also have rising unemployment at the same time. We call that stagflation, a stagnant economy. Increased inflation rates also increase unemployment. It's bad, 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 bad. We'll talk more about why it's bad later. But that's cost push inflation. How do you know what's causing inflation? You don't. Price levels rising. We don't actually have real grasp for the US economy. We do our best to try and figure out what's happening, but we don't. The only way to really understand what's causing inflation is if we can isolate the variables like we can in an econ class. But in reality, we're just looking at unemployment and inflation. If both of them are moving in the same direction, it must be stagflation, right? Cost push. If only inflation is going up, unemployment rate is low, then it's probably demand pull and could result in hyperinflation. Duration varies. Cost push inflation is self-limiting. When people lose jobs, eventually they'll negotiate lower wages. They'll say, hey, I've been out of a job for a long time, so I'll just take any job. You can pay me less than you paid me before for the same job. And when wages fall, eventually supply shifts back to the right, and we get back to life. It's painful when it's happening, but it's self-limiting. Demand pull inflation has no limit. It can go on forever. right? This is a classic example here where you have a starving billionaire, right? Somebody who has over $1 billion on the cardboard because $1 billion doesn't buy anything in that nation. So hyperinflation can completely devastate an economy. Okay, we'll actually go over this example in class. Moving on. One more term that you need to know is disinflation. When the inflation rate is decreasing over time, it's called disinflation. When it's negative, it's deflation. So if last year our inflation rate was 10%, this year it's 8%, disinflation is happening. The inflation rate is falling. But if last year it was 10% and this year it's negative 5%, deflation is happening. It is negative. That's just terminology, my friends. Okay, this impact is felt differently for different people, but the main area it hits is in our income. That's what we care the most about, right? So the way that you can figure this out is twofold. You can figure out the impact of inflation on real income through simply taking your nominal income. So you got a raise of $1,000. Income is $1,000, and you just divide it by CPI. Whatever that CPI is, you just put it in hundreds, and that gives you your real income. In other words, the buying power of your income is your real income. So you take whatever your actual raise was, divide it by CPI in hundreds, and I'll show you that in a second. That gives you real income. Another way is if you have percent change, you simply take your percent change in nominal income, you got a 10% raise, change percent price level went up 4%. What happened to your real income? Well, it went up by 6%. Okay? So let's check it out. Let's try this a couple times. Let's say our CPI is 120. So this would be 1.2. Let's say your income is 10,000. 10,000. So I make $10,000 a year. My CPI is 1.2. What is the buying power of that nominal income? Well, first of all, you got to make sure that you are taking into account, I got my calculator here. You got to make sure that you're putting CPI in hundreds. So it's not 120, it's 1.2. That's key to this. So I take 10,000 divided by 1.2, and that kicks out 8,333. In other words, yes, I have $10,000, but it's only going to buy me about 8,333 worth of goods. That's my real income when adjusted for inflation. Let's say I got a 10% raise. So my change in nominal income is 10%. Nominal is just what you actually got, 10%. Let's say inflation went up by 12%, right? So our inflation rate is going up. Cost push or demand pull, we don't know, but 12%. What's my change in real income? It's 10% minus 12. So my real income actually went down by 2%. And this is what we were talking about at the beginning of this, right? 10 minus 12 is negative 2%. The only time that our price level is going to have a big negative of consequence is when price level is outpacing income, which is exactly what's happening here. People are getting poorer. I can buy 2% less than I could before this inflation hit. Okay. So there are a couple of critiques of CPI and of using inflation rates. Number one is it doesn't account for the substitute effect, right? When prices go up for something, it assumes you're going to continue to buy that good. But in reality, when the price goes up for something, if it's a problem, we'll just search out something that's cheaper and we'll substitute it out. It's the reason the demand curve is downward sloping. We know this already. But CPI doesn't account for that, so it's not truly an accurate indication of the misery we're experiencing with inflation. Some of that misery is mitigated or made better because we can just sub it out for a cheaper product. Number two, market basket is not accurate. Frankly, yes, it allows us to measure changes in prices at least a little bit, but everybody's preference on what they buy varies greatly, right? What you pay for housing, what kind of consumer goods you prefer, what you actually buy in your basket versus the market basket indicated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, very different things. So no basket actually represents the variety of goods and services. We know people that are poor have different variety than people who are very, very wealthy. So the impact of a change in prices is different for every person. So CPI doesn't really account for that. Okay, so in order to try and mitigate some of these things, oftentimes we'll give an inflation rate. We'll say, hey, the inflation rate went up 4% this quarter. Whatever. And then you will hear them say the core inflation rate went up by 4% or 3% or 2%. What's happening here? Well, generally, economists know that food and energy prices change wildly. They're very volatile. And so they have an outsized impact on the market basket and they have an outsized impact on CPI. So maybe if we get rid of those, we get rid of our expenditures on food and our expenditures on energy in our market basket, we'll have a more accurate vision of what's happening in our economy. Gas prices are always going to change. Let's get rid of that so that we can truly see what's happening to regular prices of goods that normally have stable prices. We call this core inflation. When core inflation is rising, that means we have a problem outside of the volatile markets of food and energy, right? We have prices rising in goods where prices are normally pretty stable. And that means we have a real problem. We call that core inflation. It's just corrected, and we take food and energy out of it. That's it. Khan Academy 2.4, make sure you have those equations in front of you, market basket in order to calculate CPI, inflation, and then going from nominal wages to real wages using both nominal income divided by CPI in hundreds to get that real income and percent change in nominal income minus inflation rate to get your real change in income or percent change in income. All right, good luck and talk to you soon.